$40 billion. That's how much Donald Trump just handed American farmers to save them from his own trade war. But here's the problem. Canadian producers are the ones celebrating. Because while American farmers got government checks to survive, Canadian farmers got something far more valuable: permanent access to the markets Trump thought he was protecting. This is the story of how the largest agricultural bailout in American history became the greatest gift Trump ever gave to Canada. How a policy designed to help American farmers actually accelerated their decline. And how billions in taxpayer money ended up financing the rise of Canadian agricultural dominance across North America. Tonight, we're showing you the real numbers behind Trump's farm aid disaster, which Canadian producers are gaining billions while American farmers lose ground, and why every dollar Trump spends trying to save American agriculture is another dollar proving he never understood how global food markets actually work. But before we dive into this story, if you appreciate in-depth analysis like this, hit that like button and subscribe to stay informed on the stories that truly matter. The $40 billion promise. Let's start with what Trump actually announced. January 2025, a White House ceremony. Farm state senators sitting in the front row. Agricultural industry lobbyists packed into the East Room. Trump stands at the podium and declares victory. We're giving American farmers $40 billion. Nobody has ever done anything like this for farmers. Nobody. This will be the greatest thing that's ever happened to American agriculture. The breakdown was simple. $11 billion goes directly to row crop farmers by the end of February. Immediate cash payments to corn, soybean, and wheat producers hit hardest by the trade war. Another $1 billion held back for fruits, vegetables, and specialty crops. Distribution comes later, after the initial wave of payments. The remaining amounts spread across various agricultural support programs: loan forgiveness, insurance subsidies, infrastructure grants. On paper, it looked like salvation. American farmers had been suffering for years. 3 consecutive years of substantial production losses, markets disappearing, input costs rising, debt mounting. Trump's bailout was supposed to fix everything. But here's what the White House didn't mention in that ceremony. The bailout wasn't solving the problem. It was masking it. Because while American farmers were getting checks, Canadian farmers were getting markets, permanent markets, markets that used to belong to American producers. And once those markets shifted to Canadian suppliers, no amount of government money would bring them back. Why American farmers needed the bailout. To understand why the $40 billion became necessary, you need to understand what Trump's trade war did to American agriculture. It started with tariffs on China. For decades, China was America's largest agricultural export market. American soybeans, pork, dairy, wheat, all of it flowed to Chinese buyers in massive volumes. Then Trump launched his trade war. China retaliated immediately. They stopped buying American agricultural products almost entirely. The market that American farmers depended on simply vanished. American soybean exports to China collapsed. Through early November 2024, total soybean sales to all destinations were 40% lower than the same period a year earlier. 40%. That's not a market correction. That's a market elimination. But it wasn't just China. Trump's tariffs on Canada triggered Canadian counter-tariffs on American agricultural products, dairy, grains, processed foods, all subject to retaliatory measures. Mexico, watching the chaos, started diversifying away from American suppliers. Too much uncertainty, too much risk of sudden policy changes. Europe responded to Trump's steel and aluminum tariffs with agricultural countermeasures. Within 2 years, American farmers found themselves locked out of multiple major export markets simultaneously. The result was predictable and devastating. Net farm income projections for 2026 show a decline of more than $30 billion compared to previous years. This accounts for falling crop prices and reduced government payments from earlier programs. American farmers are set to receive nearly $40 billion in government payments this year. That's approaching a record. Not because agriculture is thriving, because it's on life support. The American Soybean Association reported that farmers expect their 3rd consecutive year of substantial losses, the longest stretch of sustained losses in 2 decades. One farmer from Iowa put it bluntly at Trump's announcement event: the $12 billion is like Christmas came early, but it won't cover the $15 billion we've already lost from the trade war. Translation: the bailout helps, but it doesn't fix anything. And here's the part Trump doesn't understand. Government checks are temporary. Market losses are permanent. When Chinese buyers stopped purchasing American soybeans, they didn't just wait for the trade war to end. They found alternative suppliers: Brazilian soybeans, Argentine grains, Canadian wheat, and barley. And once those relationships were established, once the logistics were in place, once the supply chains were restructured, they didn't simply reverse when American tariffs decreased. Market share, once lost, is extraordinarily difficult to reclaim. So Trump's $40 billion bailout isn't rebuilding American agriculture. It's paying farmers to slowly go out of business while global markets move on without them. While America paid farmers, Canada captured markets. While Trump was writing checks to American farmers, something else was happening. Canadian agricultural producers were quietly signing the biggest export contracts of their lives. Let's start with grain. September 2025. Canadian Pacific Kansas City runs a 3,200-kilometer grain train from Manitoba to Mexico City. Canadian Western Red Spring wheat, premium quality, delivered directly to Mexican flour mills without touching American soil. Prime Minister Mark Carney and CPKC President Keith Creel stood together in Mexico City to celebrate the arrival. This wasn't a publicity stunt. This was proof of concept. According to CPKC's official statements, the railroad now moves a variety of Canadian grains to Mexico regularly: wheat, oats, canola oils, specialty crops. And here's the critical detail. This grain used to go through American ports. For over a century, Western Canadian grain flowed south to American export terminals, grain elevators in the Dakotas, export facilities on the Gulf Coast, Pacific Northwest ports. American logistics companies collected fees at every transfer point. American railroads hauled the cargo. American port operators loaded the ships. That entire revenue stream is now being redirected. CPKC's 3,200-kilometer route from Manitoba to Mexico City crosses American territory. Yes, but it bypasses American export infrastructure entirely. The grain goes directly from Canadian producers to Mexican buyers. No American intermediaries. No American export fees. No dependence on American ports that might suddenly become unreliable due to Trump's policy chaos. Keith Creel said it explicitly. With grain customers looking to diversify their end markets amid trade policy uncertainty, CPKC is uniquely serving as a land bridge between Canada and Mexico. Trade policy uncertainty, diplomatic code for Trump's chaos. And it's not just Mexico. Canadian grain exports to Asia have been expanding rapidly. The Port of Vancouver handled approximately 20 million metric tons of grain in recent years. The Port of Prince Rupert is being expanded specifically to handle more grain exports. Canadian National Railway transported 21 million metric tons of grain toward Western Canada ports, another 4.54 million metric tons toward Eastern Canada. All of this grain used to flow through American infrastructure on its way to global markets. Now it's going through Canadian ports, on Canadian rails, to buyers who are actively trying to reduce dependence on American suppliers. The potash disaster. Then there's potash. This is where Trump's policy became genuinely catastrophic for American farmers. Potash is one of three critical nutrients every plant needs to survive: nitrogen, phosphate, and potassium, which comes from potash. Without all three, crops fail. There are no substitutes, no alternatives. The United States uses approximately 5.3 million tons of potash annually. American farmers spread it on cornfields in Iowa, wheat fields in Kansas, potato farms in Idaho. Here's the problem. The United States produces only about 400,000 tons of potash domestically. That covers roughly 7.5% of annual demand. The other 92.5% must be imported, and 79% of that imported potash comes from Canada, specifically from Saskatchewan, which sits atop the largest high-quality potash deposits in the world and produces about one-third of global supply. Canada has 1.1 billion tons of potash reserves. The United States has 220 million tons. Canada produced 21.9 million tons in 2023. America produced 400,000 tons. American agriculture is completely, structurally, existentially dependent on Canadian potash, and Trump threatened to cut off the supply. Earlier in 2025, Trump announced 25% tariffs on all Canadian goods, including fertilizer. The response from American agriculture was immediate panic. Between early January and late February, the price of potash jumped from $330 per short ton to $348, Republican lawmakers from farming states flooded the White House with calls. Senator Chuck Grassley of Iowa publicly pressured Trump to exempt fertilizer. Trump eventually backed down, sort of. He reduced the tariff from 25% to 10%. But just months later, he's threatening again. Not 10%, not 25%. Very severe tariffs. His exact words. At a White House roundtable, Trump literally said, "A lot of it does come in from Canada, and so we will end up putting very severe tariffs on that if we have to. You will be making your own fertilizer very soon. This is economic delusion on a scale that defies comprehension. You cannot make your own potash. Potash comes from naturally occurring underground deposits that took millions of years to form. The United States simply does not have sufficient high-quality deposits to meet domestic demand. That's not policy failure. That's geology. Building new potash mines takes 10 to 15 years. Even if American companies decided tomorrow to invest billions, those mines wouldn't be operational until the late 2030s. So what are American farmers supposed to do in the meantime? And here's where it gets worse. If Trump follows through on severe potash tariffs, American farmers have exactly three options. 1. Pay dramatically higher prices for Canadian potash, absorbing costs that will bankrupt smaller operations. 2. Reduce fertilizer use, accept lower crop yields, and watch their income collapse. 3. Start buying from Russia and Belarus. Russia and Belarus control about 37.5% of the world's potash production. So Trump's tariff strategy would force American farmers to choose between financial ruin or dependence on authoritarian regimes that use resource exports as geopolitical weapons. Saskatchewan Premier Scott Moe said it explicitly. They would have to buy it somewhere else. Namely, Russia would be the option. I think most Americans would agree that we would much rather get our potash from our friends in Canada than from Russia and Belarus. But Trump doesn't care about geopolitics when he's focused on tariffs. Meanwhile, Canadian potash producers are preparing for exactly this scenario. They've been actively building relationships with alternative buyers for months. Europe, Asia, Latin America, all regions that need potash and would happily buy from Canadian suppliers if American demand drops. Nutrien, one of Canada's largest potash producers, recently announced plans to build a new $1 billion export facility in Washington state specifically to reach Asian markets more efficiently. The Saskatchewan Mining Association has been clear. If American tariffs make the U.S. market unprofitable, Canadian producers will redirect supply to other global markets. They have the capacity, they have the relationships, they're just waiting for Trump to give them a reason to shift. And when that shift happens, it won't reverse. Because once Asian and European buyers establish reliable supply relationships with Canadian producers, those relationships persist. American farmers will be left scrambling for overpriced Russian fertilizer, while Canadian producers enjoy stable, diversified global demand. The subsidy trap. This brings us back to the $40 billion bailout. Trump's farm aid isn't solving the underlying problems. It's creating a new one: permanent subsidy dependence. Michael Langemeyer, director of the Center for Commercial Agriculture at Purdue University, warned that Trump's approach could prove counterproductive. His analysis, the subsidies, mark not an end of the cycle of agricultural subsidies, but a new beginning. Translation: American farmers are becoming permanently dependent on government handouts to survive, not because of market forces, not because of competition, but because their own president made their industry uncompetitive through self-inflicted tariff wounds. Here's how the trap works. Trump's tariffs raise input costs for American farmers. Fertilizer costs more. Equipment costs more. Everything imported faces higher prices. Simultaneously, Trump's trade war closes export markets. China stops buying. Canada retaliates. Mexico diversifies away. American farmers get squeezed from both sides. Higher costs, lower revenues. So Trump gives them subsidies to absorb the difference. But the subsidies are temporary. They're political. They depend on congressional appropriations and presidential priorities. The moment political winds shift, the subsidies can disappear. Meanwhile, the underlying problems, high input costs, and lost export markets don't disappear. They get worse, because while American farmers are on life support, Canadian farmers are building permanent market relationships that will outlast any subsidy program. Fertilizer accounts for more than 35% of operating costs for corn and wheat producers. That's the single largest input expense. When Trump tariffs potash, he's hitting American farmers in their most vulnerable spot, while handing Canadian producers a captive customer base desperate for supply. The subsidies mask this pain temporarily, but they don't fix it. One Iowa farmer said it perfectly. "We got the check, but we're still losing, because government money can keep you alive, but it can't make you competitive." Canada's long-term gains. While American farmers depend on government checks, Canadian producers are making investments that will pay dividends for decades. Agricultural infrastructure across Canada is being upgraded specifically to handle increased export volumes. The Port of Churchill, once barely economically viable, is receiving $180 million over 5 years to upgrade port facilities, modernize the railroad, and build ice-breaking capacity. The goal: extend the shipping season from 4 months to potentially year-round operations. Create infrastructure for exporting grain, potash, liquefied natural gas, and critical minerals. This isn't about serving American markets. This is about bypassing them entirely. The Hudson Bay Railway is being upgraded to Class 1 standards, with $262 million in federal and provincial investment. That means heavy freight cars, unit trains, hauling bulk minerals, and the kind of reliability that makes long-term logistics decisions possible. Every ton of grain that ships through Churchill instead of American Gulf Coast ports is revenue American companies will never recapture. Canadian Pacific Kansas City announced over $500 million Canadian dollars in investment in high-capacity hopper cars, plus taking delivery of 100 new Tier 4 diesel-electric locomotives in 2025. These investments are designed to move more grain more efficiently across CPKC's three-nation network. Canadian National S 2025 to 2026 grain plan demonstrates commitment to moving 27 to 29.5 million metric tons with sufficient resources in place. And critically, these are not temporary workarounds. This is permanent infrastructure for a post-American agricultural trade system. Once Mexico signs multi-year contracts with Canadian grain suppliers, those contracts don't get cancelled if Trump leaves office. Once Asian buyers establish reliable supply chains through Canadian ports, they don't suddenly revert to American roots just because political leadership changes. The relationships being built now will persist for decades. The irony Trump doesn't see. Here's what makes this entire situation so perfectly absurd. Trump genuinely believes he's helping American farmers. He stands at podiums and brags about the $40 billion bailout. He tells agricultural audiences that he's the greatest president for farmers in American history. And in one sense, he's right. No president has ever given farmers more money. But that's not because American agriculture is thriving. It's because Trump destroyed it and is now paying farmers to pretend everything is fine. The $40 billion doesn't rebuild competitiveness. It doesn't recapture lost markets. It doesn't make American agriculture sustainable. It's a temporary painkiller for a terminal disease. Meanwhile, Canada is building an agricultural export empire on the foundation of Trump's chaos. Every tariff threat pushes more buyers toward Canadian suppliers. Every trade war escalation convinces more countries that depending on American agriculture is too risky. And Trump, completely oblivious to the long-term consequences, keeps doubling down. He threatens more tariffs on fertilizer, which will raise costs for American farmers and increase demand for Canadian potash globally. He threatens Canada's sovereignty, which accelerates Canadian infrastructure investments designed to eliminate dependence on American roots. He gives farmers government checks, which trains them to accept subsidies instead of demanding policies that would actually restore competitiveness. It's a masterclass in self-sabotage disguised as strength. What happens next? The trajectory is clear. American farmers will receive their $40 billion. Many will use it to pay down debt, cover operating expenses, and survive another year. But the underlying problems won't be solved. Input costs will remain high as long as tariffs persist. Export markets won't return as long as trade policy remains chaotic and unpredictable. So next year, farmers will need another bailout, and the year after that, and the year after that. American agriculture is becoming a subsidized industry that exists to consume government money rather than compete in global markets. Meanwhile, Canadian agriculture is becoming a genuinely competitive global powerhouse. Canadian grain reaches Mexican buyers without American intermediaries. Canadian potash reaches European and Asian markets through diversified export channels. Canadian infrastructure investments create permanent alternatives to American roots. The food security implications are profound. For generations, American agricultural dominance was a strategic asset. The ability to feed allies, influence trade negotiations, and leverage food exports as geopolitical tools. That dominance is eroding in real time, not because American farmers are less capable, but because American policy made them less competitive, and once that competitive edge is gone, it doesn't come back just because subsidies increase. The $40 billion truth. Donald Trump gave American farmers $40 billion and called it a victory. But victories don't require permanent life support. Victories don't leave your industry dependent on government checks to survive. Victories don't hand your competitors the markets you use to dominate. The $40 billion bailout is not evidence of Trump's support for American agriculture. It's evidence of how completely he destroyed it. American farmers are getting government checks, while Canadian farmers are getting export contracts, infrastructure investments, and permanent market share. One side got a handout, the other got an empire. And every dollar Trump spends trying to convince American farmers he is helping them is another dollar proving he never understood the difference between temporary relief and long-term competitiveness. The greatest irony of Trump's farm policy is this: he wanted to make American agriculture great again. Instead, he made Canadian agriculture great for the first time. And the $40 billion he's spending won't change that fact, because you can't subsidize your way out of strategic incompetence. You can only delay the moment when everyone realizes the emperor has no clothes. The farmers have no markets, and the bailout was never a solution. It was an